Hello everyone, I would like to share with you something important about grammar, and my topic is about punctuation. So this is really important for especially for writing, and I will use my scrapbook, and this is really interesting. So this is the example of the punctuation. So we open, and the first is about full stop, question mark, and exclamation mark. There are three parts of this. Number one is sentence division. Number two is abbreviation. Number three is direct question. So full stop, question mark, exclamation mark are to close sentence. After one of these, a new sentence has a capital letter. So for example, this one, I took this from the movie, and they use capital letter after this punctuation or question mark. And this is which lamp do I take first, and the other example is enclosed in any of the sky, for this is my light, full stop. So we do not normally use full stop or question mark or exclamation mark to close grammatically incomplete sentence. So for example, she phoned me as soon as she arrived, and not she phoned me full stop as soon as she arrived. So however, sometimes we can emphasize a clause of phrase by separating it with a full stop and capital letters. For example, people are sleeping out the streets in Britain in the 20th century because there are not enough houses. And we're moving on to abbreviation. Full stop can be used after many abbreviations, but they are often dropped in modern British English. For example, Dr. full stop, Andrew C. full stop, Bird, comma, M full stop, A full stop. So this is the example to use abbreviation, to how to use punctuation for abbreviation. We're moving on to indirect question. Sorry. We do not use question mark after indirect question. For example, I asked her what it was, and we just use a full stop and not what time it was, question mark, and not like that. So we're moving on to colon. So there are 6 parts of this, and number 1 is explanation. A colon usually introduces an explanation or further details. For example, we decided not to go to Mexico, colon, we had too little money. So this is for number 1 is for the explanation. Number 2 is list. This is very common. We see everywhere they use colon for the list, and a colon can introduce a list. For example, the main points are as follows: colon 1, 2, 3, and so on. Number 3 is subdivision. A colon can introduce a subdivision of a subject in a title or heading. For example, like this: punctuation, colon, colon. And this is the example number 1. So this is for subdivision. Number 4 is capital. In British English, it is unusual for a capital letter to follow a colon, except at the beginning of the quotation. However, this can be happen if a colon is followed by several complete sentences. For example, my main objection are as follows: colon. First of all, no complete budget has blah blah blah. Secondly, there is no guarantee, and so on. In American English, colons are more often followed by capital letters. And number 5 is letters. Americans usually put a colon after the opening salutation, like dear blah 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 in a business letter. For example, dear Mr. colon I am writing to. British users prefer a comma or no punctuation mark at all in this case. Number 6 is direct speech. Normally, direct speech is introduced by comma in writing. For example, Stewart opened his eyes and said, "Who's your beautiful friend?" But long passages of direct speech may be introduced by a colon. And example number 2, introducing his report for the year. The chairman said, colon, a number, blah blah blah. And a colon is used when direct speech is introduced by a name or short phrase. For example, Polonius, colon, what do you read, my lord? Hamlet, colon, words, words, words. And this is the example of how to use the colon. This is one of the film I took from YouTube, and this is another example. And we're moving on to semicolon. So there are two parts of this, and number 1 is instead of full stop. Semicolon are sometimes used instead of full stop in case where sentences are grammatically independent but the meaning is closely connected. Semicolon are not really as common as full stop or commas. Some people work best in the morning, others do better in the evening. Commas are not usually possible in cases like this. So we're moving on to number 2, in list. Semicolon can also be used to separate items in a list, particularly when these are grammatically complex. For example, you may use this for facilities on condition that your subscription is paid regularly, that you arrange for all necessary cleaning to be carried out, that you undertake to make good any damage. So we're moving on to comma. So there are 11 parts of this. Number 1 is the basic sentence. See, we open. So we do not use commas to separate the basic parts of sentence, subject and verb, verb and object. For example, the standards of living of the dock workers were slowly improving, and it's not the standards of living of the dock workers, comma, was slowly improving. So many of them were able to begin buying their own homes, and this is the second example. And not many of them were able to begin buying, comma, their own homes. So this is the basic sentence. So we do not use commas in the middle of the sentence. So this will be the whole sentence. Number 2 is before and after the basic sentence. If we put long adverbial expression before the basic sentence, we often use a comma. Compare, for example, at the time the standard of living of the dock workers was slowly improving during the late 1920s and early 1930s. The standard of living of the dock workers was slowly improving. We do not so often put commas when adverbial expression come after the basic sentence. For example, the standard of living of the dock workers was slowly improving during the late 1920s and early 1930s. So we're moving on to number 3, inside the basic sentence. Number 4, noun phrase. Number 5, sentence with conjunction. Number 6, indirect speech. So inside the basic sentence, when adverbial expression come between or inside parts of the basic sentence, we may put commas before and after them. For example, the standard of living of the dog workers, during the late 1920s and early 1930s was steadily improving. So number 4, noun phrase. We do not usually separate a noun from the adjective or other expression that go with it. For example, the mainly foreign laborers, and not the mainly foreign, laborers. However, we do use commas to separate non-identifying expression. For example, Andres Bergmeister, who established the dog workers union. Number 5 is sentence with conjunctions. We often put commas in sentence with conjunction, especially in longer sentence. Compare the situation changed when the export market began to contract. We usually use a comma if we start with the conjunction. For example, when the export market began to contract, the situation changed. Number 6 is indirect speech. We do not put commas after verb of saying, thinking, etc. in indirect speech. For example, many commentators declare that the economy was in serious trouble, and not many commentators declare, that the economy and a useful rule, we do not put a comma before la or conjunction or relative pronoun. For example, they did not understand that the economic condition that had existed earlier had disappeared for good. So we're moving on to number 7 until up to 11. And number 7 is between grammatically separate sentence, conjunction and adverb, commas between adjectives, leads, and numbers. So we open this. Number 7 is between grammatically separate sentence. Between grammatically separate sentence with no conjunction, we use a full stop or a semicolon but not a comma. Compare orders began to dry up and most companies reduced their workforce, comma and conjunction. Orders began to dry up, most companies started to reduce their workforce. Orders began to dry up, most companies started to reduce their workforce. Number 8, conjunction and adverb. Note that some linking verb, etc., for example, consequently, however, therefore are verb, not conjunction. A sentence beginning with a verb is grammatically separate from the sentence before it. Consequently, a full stop or semicolon is necessary between the sentence. For example, orders began to dry up. Consequently, most companies started to reduce their workplace, and not orders began to dry up. Consequently, most, and blah 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 is not like that. Number 9 is commas between adjective. Before noun, we use commas mostly to separate adjective that give the same or related kinds of information. For example, a tall, impressive figure, a long, boring speech. Commas are sometimes dropped between short adjectives. For example, a tall, dark, handsome cowboy, and so on. Commas are not dropped when adjective or other modifier refers to different parts of something. For example, a green, red, and gold carpet, and not a green, red, and gold carpet. So we use comma here. Before noun, commas are not normally used when adjectives give different kinds of information. For example, have you met our handsome new financial director? And not our new financial director. In this case, it's not like this, but it's like this. After be and other linking verb, adjectives are punctuated like a list. For example, his speech was long, boring, detailed, and irrelevant. Now, we're moving on to number 7. Number 10 is list. We use commas to separate the different things in a list, but not normally before and unless the last item is long. Compare the developing crisis affects manufacturers, distributors, marketing organizations, banks, and credit agencies. Number 11 is numbers. Commas are used to divide large numbers into groups of their figures by separating of the thousands and millions. For example, 6,435 or 6,435, and not 6 plus up for 35. We do not always use commas in four-figure numbers, and they are never used in dates. So it's something like this. You can see space are sometimes used instead of commas. There are 1000 millimeters and 1 meter. We do not use comma in decimals, and you can see this 3.5 and 3,5, and it's not like this. So this is the example of how to use comma. See? Okay, we're moving on to dash and quotation marks. So this is the last punctuations. And dashes are especially common in informal writing. They can be used in the same way as colon, semicolon, or brackets. For example, there are 3 things I can never remember: dash, name, face, and blah blah blah. We had great time in Greece. Dash, the kids really love it. A dash can introduce an afterthought or something unexpected and surprising. For example, we'll be arriving on Monday morning. At least, I think so. So this is the example of dash. And this is the example of dash. This one, you can use that for the years. And we're moving on to quotation mark. Quotation mark can be single or double, something like this. They are also called inverted commas in British English. Number 1 is direct speech. We use quotation mark or single or double when we quote direct speech. For quotation inside quotation, we use double quotation mark inside single or single inside double. For example, his last words said Albert were close that window. American users often prefer single quotation mark inside double in this case. Number of words. We often put quotation mark, usually single round words, which are used in special way. For example, when we talk about them special meanings. For example, I saw the bullet walk around the garden, so we can use the quotation mark here. American users often use double quotation in this case. So this is the example of quotation mark: Titanic and can. This is for direct speech. And so this is the explanation about the punctuation. I hope that you understand, and this is really good for learn something, and it will be interesting for someone who wants to learn something new with the scrapbook. So this is my explanation.